Father's Day. The table was set for two. Steaks marinated the way he liked, his favorite beer sweating on the counter. I'd pressed my shirt, knotted my tie, even lit the small candle my wife used to place between us. By 8, the food was cold. By 10, the candle had burned to nothing. Midnight came with no call, no message, just the weight of a truth I could no longer ignore, and a decision that would change everything. I still remember the first night we slept in that house. It was winter and the wind rattled the windows like it was trying to come inside. I'd put Daniel to bed in his new room, the paint still smelling faintly of fresh blue, and I sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea, staring at boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. The heater clunked in protest every few minutes, and I thought to myself, this is ours now. This is where we start over. Daniel was only 5, small enough to be carried upstairs when he fell asleep in the car. He had his mother's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, though back then his stubbornness showed mostly in refusing to eat his vegetables. His mother had been gone almost 2 years by then. A sudden illness, the kind that sweeps in and changes your whole life before you even understand what's happening. I had buried her in the churchyard 2 streets over from her parents, then spent months figuring out how to keep moving forward. The house was my anchor, a modest 2-bedroom with a sloping garden and a chipped brick path leading to the front door, but to me it was a fortress. Every nail hammered, every wall painted, every curtain sewn was a way of saying to Daniel, we are safe here, no matter what. Those early years were simple, though not easy. I worked as a mechanic at a small garage, often coming home with the smell of oil in my clothes. Daniel would meet me at the door with some new drawing clutched in his hand, usually a car with wheels as big as the house. Dinner was whatever I could throw together: grilled cheese, soup from a can, the occasional roast chicken when payday was good. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. Father's Days back then were loud in the best ways. Daniel would sneak into my room before sunrise, a tray in his little hands wobbling dangerously under the weight of burnt toast, runny eggs, and orange juice that tasted like it had been poured straight from the carton. I'd eat every bite, praising his chef skills, even as I tried to swallow the eggs without grimacing. One year, he made me a card out of construction paper. The cover was lopsided, the glue barely holding the edges together, but inside he'd written, "To the best dad in the whole world, you fix everything." I kept that card in my top drawer for years, tucked under my socks like a secret treasure. When he was 8, we started our fishing trips. Every summer, just the 2 of us would drive out to the lake with a cooler of sandwiches and a tackle box that had seen better days. We rarely caught anything worth keeping, but it didn't matter. The point was the quiet, the sound of the water against the dock, the feel of the sun on our shoulders, the way Daniel's voice softened when he told me about school or friends or dreams that seemed impossibly big. By the time he turned 13, he was helping me with repairs around the house. At first, he just held the flashlight or passed me tools, but soon he was tightening bolts, sanding wood, and learning the difference between a flathead and a Phillips screwdriver. I like to think those afternoons taught him more than just how to fix a fence or patch a leaky roof. They taught him patience, problem solving, and the satisfaction of making something with your own hands. We had our traditions. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, even if we were late to church because of them. Friday nights were for movies. Sometimes an old VHS tape we'd watched a dozen times. Other nights something new if the video store had a good deal. Every December we'd decorate the Christmas tree together, Daniel untangling the lights while I hung the heavier ornaments high enough that the cat couldn't reach them. It wasn't perfect. There were scraped knees, arguments over homework, and the occasional slammed door when teenage moods got the better of him. But under all of it was a steady current of love, unshaken and unspoken in the way men often show it, through doing, not saying. I took pride in the fact that Daniel never went without. When the garage cut my hours, I picked up evening shifts doing deliveries. When he needed a suit for prom, I worked weekends to cover it. I didn't have much to give him in material terms, but I made sure he always had the things that mattered: stability, encouragement, and a home that never changed. Looking back now, those years feel almost golden, not because they were perfect, but because they were full of noise, of mess, of small joys that didn't need an audience. I didn't know then how fragile that kind of closeness could be, how easily it could be chipped away by time, new priorities, and the slow creep of distance. But in those days, when Daniel would sit on the porch with me at night, sipping cocoa and asking questions about the stars, I thought we had all the time in the world. I couldn't have imagined a day when Father's Day would pass in silence, when the boy who once couldn't wait to celebrate me would forget I existed. Back then, I believed that the good years were just the beginning. I didn't know they were also, in some ways, the end. The first change was so small I almost missed it. It was the year Daniel turned 20 and started working full-time at an accounting firm. I told myself it was normal. Young men got busy, found their footing, had less time for fishing trips and long talks on the porch. That first Father's Day he missed. He called late in the evening, apologizing between yawns about a last-minute work emergency. I believed him, or maybe I wanted to. After all, I knew how exhausting it could be to come home after a long day and still try to be present for someone else. I told him not to worry, that we'd celebrate next weekend. But next weekend turned into the weekend after that, and eventually, it just never happened. The phone calls became shorter. The once-weekly dinners we used to share started spacing out, 2 weeks apart, then 3. When we did meet, he often had one eye on his phone, texting someone I didn't know. Then he mentioned her, Sarah. The way he spoke about her at first made me smile, the nervous energy in his voice, the small details he offered without realizing it. How she liked her coffee, how she'd once beaten him at chess, how she made him eat things I never thought I'd like. I was happy for him, genuinely. I'd spent years worrying he'd end up lonely, like me. But as Sarah moved from the edges of our conversations to the center, I noticed something else shifting. Our time together wasn't just less frequent. It was shorter, distracted. If we met for lunch, Sarah would call halfway through and he'd leave early to meet her. If I invited him over on a Saturday, he'd decline because they had plans. I told myself this was natural. Love was new and exciting. It pulled you in. The second Father's Day he missed, he didn't call until the next morning. Said they'd gone away for the weekend and he'd forgotten what day it was. I laughed it off, told him I understood. But I remember standing in the kitchen after the call, staring at the table I'd set the night before, the plates still stacked neatly, the beer still in the fridge. The silence in the house had felt different that night, heavier. When Sarah eventually moved in with him, I noticed the first subtle changes in how he spoke to me. There was a faint edge in his tone sometimes, like he was humoring me. He started telling me I worried too much, that I didn't need to check in so often. Little things I said were met with a faint sigh or a glance at his phone. And then there were the holidays. The first Christmas after they moved in together, my invitation came 2 days before, via text. I showed up with the gifts I'd chosen carefully, only to find the table already full. Sarah's family was there, loud and cheerful, and I was seated at the far end, so far from Daniel that I had to lean forward just to hear him. When I tried to talk to him after dinner, Sarah appeared beside him, hand on his arm, pulling him into another conversation. I told myself not to read into it. The next Easter there was no invitation at all. I heard about the gathering from a neighbor whose niece was friends with Sarah. I told the neighbor I must have had other plans. I didn't. It was around then that I started noticing their comments. Casual, maybe even thoughtless, but each one left a mark. Sarah would say, "You've kept this house the same since forever, huh?" Or, "Daniel, maybe you should get him to try something new." Daniel would laugh, agreeing, as if I wasn't standing right there. Once, when I brought up the idea of going fishing again, Daniel smiled faintly and said, "We'll see." That had always been our thing, the one tradition untouched by time. But we never went again. By then I'd learned to hide my disappointment. I stopped setting the table for two unless I knew for sure he was coming. I stopped calling on Sundays to invite him for dinner. The invitations had started to feel like a test I kept failing. I began to see the space between us not as a sudden gap, but as something that had been slowly widening year by year. And while part of me still clung to the hope that it was just a phase, another part, the quieter, more honest part, was starting to wonder if I was no longer a priority in his life. One evening, after another missed dinner, I sat in the living room and took out the old photo albums. There we were, Daniel at 6, holding up a crooked birdhouse we'd built together. Daniel at 10, grinning with a fish barely bigger than his hand. Daniel at 17, standing in a suit on prom night, my hand on his shoulder. I traced my finger over the glossy images and thought about the man he'd become, the man who now spoke to me more like an obligation than a son. It's strange how you can raise someone, know every childhood scar and every dream they ever whispered to you, and still wake up one day to realize you barely know them at all. I told myself I could live with less time together, fewer calls, fewer holidays. But somewhere deep down, I already knew what was coming. The day would arrive when it wouldn't just be less. It would be nothing. The change from less to different happened so quietly, I didn't realize it at first. When Sarah and Daniel got married, I told myself it was a new chapter for all of us. I even bought a new suit for the occasion, a navy one that matched my late wife's favorite color. At the reception, Sarah thanked me for raising such a wonderful man, the kind of polite remark you make for the sake of the moment. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but I ignored that. It was a day for celebration. It was in the months after the wedding that I began to notice how the air shifted when I was around them. It wasn't hostile. That would have been easier to name. No, this was subtler. Like a door that was always half closed, conversations that changed when I walked into the room, decisions already made before I was told about them. When I visited their home, I noticed my place was no longer in the living room where Daniel and I used to talk for hours. Instead, I'd find myself in the kitchen, perched on a chair near the doorway, while Sarah moved briskly around, tidying or checking her phone. She had a way of asking questions that were statements in disguise. "Are you sure you want to be driving at night? You still have that old couch, right? Have you ever thought about downsizing?" At first, I brushed them off as concern, but over time, the repetition started to feel like something else, a quiet reshaping of my life that I hadn't agreed to. Family gatherings took on a new rhythm. I was still invited, but always in a way that made it clear I wasn't central to the plans. The invitations came late, the menus decided without my input, the seating arrangements placing me at the far edge of the table. One Christmas, I found myself sitting next to the coat rack, half my conversation drowned out by the clatter of guests coming and going. It wasn't just physical distance. It was the way Sarah's family seemed to circle Daniel, drawing him into their traditions as if he'd always been one of them. When I spoke, I sometimes caught Sarah's relatives exchanging glances, small smirks I couldn't quite decode. Daniel rarely noticed, or if he did, he said nothing. Once, I offered to host Thanksgiving at my house. I'd been looking forward to it, planning the menu, picturing Daniel carving the turkey like he used to, but Sarah declined for them both, saying, "It's just easier if we keep it in one place." I nodded, but later, standing alone in my kitchen, I stared at the table and realized it hadn't been set for more than one in months. The hardest moments were the little ones that no one else would have seen as significant, like the time I mentioned a leaky faucet in my kitchen. Daniel said, "I'll take care of it." But weeks passed and he never came. Eventually, I fixed it myself. It wasn't about the faucet. It was about realizing he no longer saw me as someone to show up for. The conversation shifted too. Where we once talked about everything from car engines to old fishing stories, now it was surface-level updates. Sarah would dominate most of the talking, updating me on their renovations, their vacations, their friends. When I tried to share something from my own life, the topic would quietly pivot back to them. One Sunday, during a visit, Sarah brought up the house, my house. "You've had it for, what, 30 years now?" she said, pouring coffee without looking at me. "Have you thought about what you might do with it when you're, ready to slow down?" I smiled politely, but inside, something tightened. I told her I hadn't thought that far ahead. She nodded as if I'd confirmed something she already believed. From then on, the house became a recurring topic in small, seemingly harmless ways. Daniel would mention how big it must feel for just one person. Sarah would talk about simplifying or making life easier. They never said outright what they were hinting at, but I heard it all the same. Even Father's Day, once sacred, became an afterthought. The year after their wedding, Sarah organized a brunch for her father. Daniel called me that evening to wish me a happy Father's Day, saying, "We'll make it up to you next week." But next week came and went without a word. By then, the gatherings, the invitations, the phone calls, they all felt like performances. I was no longer Daniel's father in the way I had been. I was a supporting role in someone else's story, my scenes cut shorter every time. I started noticing how my presence was managed. If I visited, Sarah would suggest Daniel walk me to my car so you can get going before it gets dark. If I called in the evening, she'd answer, saying, "Oh, we were just heading out. Can Daniel call you tomorrow?" Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. One afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't meant to. I'd arrived a bit early for dinner, letting myself in with the key Daniel had given me years ago. They were in the kitchen, voices low but not low enough. "Just saying, it would make things simpler," Sarah was saying. "I know," Daniel replied, "but let's not push too hard right now." I backed away before they could see me, my heart knocking hard against my ribs. That night, over dinner, Sarah asked me again about the house. I deflected with a joke, but inside, I knew. This wasn't just about downsizing or making my life easier. This was about them making space for themselves, even if it meant pushing me out. It was the first time I allowed myself to think that maybe, in their eyes, I wasn't a permanent fixture in their future. And that was the moment I began to realize the life I thought we were building together had quietly become theirs alone. Father's Day crept up on me that year the way winter frost creeps along a window, slow, quiet, and almost invisible until you're standing there in the cold. I had told myself the year before was a fluke. That missing one celebration didn't mean we were losing something. I clung to that belief the way a man clings to the last ember in a dying fire. This year, I thought, would be different. 2 weeks before the day, I called Daniel. "Father's Day is on the 18th this year," I said lightly, as if he needed reminding. "Yeah, I know," he replied. "We'll see what Sarah's got planned. Maybe we can do something together." Maybe. The word caught me. It was the kind of word you used for casual acquaintances, Not for the man who had carried you on his shoulders through a county fair because your shoes were rubbing your heels raw. But I ignored the sting and began preparing anyway. I cleaned the house from top to bottom. The dining table got a fresh tablecloth, the one with the navy stitching my wife had loved. I went to the butcher for ribeye steaks, the kind Daniel used to request every year, marinated in garlic and rosemary. I picked up his favorite beer, the one with the bright green label. That morning, I ironed my shirt and knotted my tie. Not because he cared, he never had, but because my wife always said special days deserved respect in how you presented yourself. The smell of the steaks marinating filled the kitchen. I set 2 plates on the table and lit the candle in the center. By 6 o'clock, I was watching the clock the way a sailor watches the horizon for land. 7 came, then 8. The beer sat untouched, the steaks cooling in their own juices. At 8:17, my phone buzzed. A text. From Daniel. "Hey Dad, something came up. We'll have to do another time. Happy Father's Day, though." I stared at the words for a long time, reading and rereading them. No explanation, no phone call, just the flat cheer of text bubbles that took less than 10 seconds to type. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, though part of me was, but because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like begging. And I had promised myself, years ago, I would never beg for my own child's attention. By 10, the candle had burned low, the steaks congealed, and the silence in the house felt almost physical, like a second set of walls closing in. I cleared the plates, put the food in the fridge, and sat in the living room with the lights off. The TV sat dark in the corner. My gaze wandered to the photo on the mantel, Daniel at 10 years old, holding a fishing pole almost taller than he was, grinning at the camera. I remembered that day vividly, the way he'd run down the dock with his catch, shouting, "We're eating this tonight," even though the fish was barely the size of my hand. That boy would never have forgotten Father's Day. But the man he'd become? I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I overheard the neighbor talking to someone over the fence. "Oh, we had a big Father's Day barbecue at our place yesterday," she said. "Sarah and Daniel came by for a bit before heading to Sarah's dad's." I don't remember walking back into the house, but I do remember the way my hands shook when I closed the door. All that talk of something came up and another time. It wasn't work. It wasn't an emergency. It was choice. My son had chosen to spend the day with someone else's father. That was when the loneliness shifted into something heavier. Not anger, not quite. More like a slow realization that the gravity between us had changed. That evening I took the steaks from the fridge, reheated one for myself, and ate it in silence. The other I wrapped in foil and carried next door to the widowed woman who lived 2 houses down. She thanked me as if I'd given her something rare, and maybe I had. After dinner, I sat at the kitchen table, the smell of garlic and rosemary still lingering, and began sorting through a stack of old papers, tax returns, insurance forms, my will. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just touching the edges of my life, I suppose, taking stock. I came across the envelope with the will inside. My handwriting on the front looked older than I remembered. I didn't open it. Not then. But for the first time, I thought about it differently. Not as something fixed and final, but as something I still had control over. That thought stayed with me all night, humming quietly beneath my breathing. Because if my son could choose where to give his time, I could choose where to give the life I'd built. Have you ever been forgotten by someone you gave everything to? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. The days after that Father's Day felt different, though nothing outwardly changed. No slammed doors, no shouting matches. Just a steady dimming of light in rooms I used to feel at home in. Daniel didn't call to reschedule. I didn't either. I told myself I was giving him space, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see how long it would take for him to notice the absence. Weeks passed. The silence between us became a kind of landscape, flat, unbroken, and hard to cross. One afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, leaned over the fence while I was tending to the roses. "Haven't seen Daniel around lately," she said, in that gentle way people use when they're fishing for answers without wanting to seem like they are. I smiled, clipped another rose, and said, "He's busy." Her eyes lingered on me a moment longer, as if she could see the truth written on my face, but she didn't press. A few days later, I ran into an old friend at the hardware store. He mentioned a barbecue Sarah and Daniel had hosted over the weekend. "Place looked great," he said. "Lots of people. You must have been proud." I nodded and muttered something about not being able to make it. The truth was, I hadn't been invited. The realization hit me in waves, not all at once. I wasn't just being forgotten in the shuffle of their lives. I was being left out on purpose. It showed in little ways. A group photo posted on social media, Daniel, Sarah, and a cluster of friends I didn't know, smiling in my backyard. My backyard. They'd borrowed it for some gathering and never mentioned it to me. A text from Daniel asking if I could drop off the spare key because Sarah needs it for the cleaners. No mention of when I'd get it back. One Saturday, I drove past their street on the way back from the grocery store. Their driveway was full of cars, music spilling from the open windows. I slowed just enough to see Daniel at the grill, flipping burgers, Sarah beside him with a drink in her hand. Neither of them looked up. That night, I sat in my kitchen sorting through more papers. I found myself pausing on the will again. This time, I opened it. The pages smelled faintly of the cedar box I kept them in. My son's name was there, in neat black ink, next to the house, the savings, the few investments I had. I stared at the words and thought about how easily they could be erased. The thought didn't feel vengeful. It felt clarifying. I began to pull away quietly the way they had. When Daniel texted to ask if I could watch their dog while they went away for the weekend, I said I had other plans. I didn't. I just didn't want to be useful only when it suited them. When Sarah called to ask if I could lend them my ladder, I told her it was in use. It wasn't. I stopped dropping by unannounced. I stopped offering to fix things. I stopped sending little reminders about holidays or anniversaries, and they didn't seem to notice. The distance gave me more time for other things. Small repairs around the house I'd been putting off, long walks through the park, quiet mornings with a book and coffee on the porch. But even in those moments of peace there was an ache, not the sharp sting of rejection, but the slow, dull bruise of being unwanted. One evening, I got a call from an old friend who volunteered at the community center. They were short on help for a repair project. Leaky sinks, a broken door hinge, a flickering light. I went down the next morning, tools in hand, and spent the day fixing what needed fixing. The gratitude in their faces felt different from anything I'd seen from Daniel or Sarah in years. It struck me that here, among strangers, my presence still mattered. A week later, I saw Sarah at the grocery store. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give to a neighbor you don't really know. "Daniel says you've been busy," she said. "Busy enough," I replied. I didn't ask how they'd been. She didn't volunteer it. Driving home, I realized something that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. They didn't miss me. Not my company, not my voice, not the small ways I'd been part of their lives. If anything, my absence seemed to make their world smoother. That night, I placed the will back in its cedar box, but this time I set it on my desk instead of tucking it away in the closet. I wasn't ready to make changes just yet, but I wanted it where I could see it, where I could be reminded every day that my life, my work, my home, my years were mine to decide the future of. I think that was the first time in a long time I felt something like control. The first real crack in the picture I'd been trying to hold together didn't appear in the present at all. It came from the past, from a promise I'd made decades ago, standing in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fading flowers. My wife had been gone barely 10 minutes when I leaned over her still body, my hand covering hers, and whispered, "I'll raise him right. I'll keep him safe. I'll keep our home for him." It wasn't a vow made in dramatic tones. It was quiet, steady, like fastening a nail into a beam, something that would hold. That promise shaped every choice I made after she died. I kept the house not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because I wanted Daniel to grow up with something unshakable beneath his feet. Even in the lean years, when the mortgage payments felt like a weight on my chest, I never considered selling. I patched the roof myself when the shingles curled, replaced the plumbing one stubborn joint at a time, painted and repainted the trim until my hands knew the rhythm by heart. To me, the house wasn't just a place to live. It was a living memory. Every scuff in the hallway had a story. Every nail hole was a marker of some milestone. Daniel's height chart penciled in the pantry doorway, the dent in the banister from when he'd tried to slide down it with a laundry basket under him. But lately, when Daniel and Sarah came around, they didn't look at it that way. They didn't see the history. They saw square footage, market value, potential. The first time I noticed it was subtle. Sarah was walking through the kitchen, tracing her hand along the counter like she was already picturing granite where the laminate was. "It's got good bones," she said. "A little updating could really increase the value." Daniel laughed in agreement. "Yeah, Dad, you could make a fortune selling this place." I smiled then, but something in me went cold. The way they said "you and this place" made it sound like I was holding something they were just waiting to collect. The next time was sharper. I'd invited them for dinner, trying to recreate the old family warmth. Halfway through the meal, Sarah mentioned, "We were talking the other night. This house would be perfect for a growing family. Great yard, nice neighborhood. You know, for kids someday." She said it casually, as if it were just an observation, but her eyes flicked toward Daniel, and his fork paused mid-air. I asked, "You talking about your family or mine?" She laughed but didn't answer. After they left that night, I found myself wandering from room to room, looking at my home through their eyes. Not the eyes of someone who'd spent 30 years protecting it, but the eyes of someone who saw it as an asset waiting to be transferred. It was the first time I let myself imagine that maybe, just maybe, their growing distance wasn't just about busyness or personality differences. Maybe it was about removing the one obstacle between them and this house, me. The feeling only grew stronger in the weeks that followed. I'd get little comments here and there. "Bet the heating bill on a place this size is brutal." Ever think about something smaller, easier to manage? It's smart to make those decisions before you have to. They were always framed as concern, but concern doesn't come up every other conversation unless it's about more than just your comfort. One evening, while putting away laundry, I noticed my spare house key missing from the bowl on my dresser. I thought I'd misplaced it until I remembered lending it to Daniel months earlier when I was out of town. He'd never returned it. I didn't say anything, but I started locking more than just the doors. Documents, personal keepsakes, even some tools went into the locked cabinet in the garage. Not because I thought they'd take them, but because I'd begun to feel like the ground beneath me was shifting. Around that time, I had coffee with an old friend who'd gone through something similar. His son had pressured him into selling his home and moving into a condo for convenience. Within a year, the relationship had soured, and he'd ended up alone in a place that never felt like his. "Guard what's yours," my friend told me, his voice low. "Not just the bricks and mortar, the story in them. Because once you give that up, you don't get it back. That conversation stuck with me. I started to see the pattern, the careful way Daniel and Sarah's life had shifted to include me less and talk about the house more. How the invitations came for holidays at their place, never mine. How Sarah always asked about my health in that polite, measured way that made it sound like she was keeping notes. The cracks in our relationship weren't just emotional anymore. They were strategic. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I knew better than to show my hand. But I began to make quiet adjustments, small acts of reclaiming space in my own life. I stopped offering them the run of the house. I limited the visits. And I began spending more time in the community center, fixing things, talking to people who saw me as more than just an obstacle to square footage. It was a strange mix, grief for the closeness we'd lost, and a growing sense of resolve that whatever they were planning, they wouldn't get it as easily as they seemed to think. The promise I made to my wife all those years ago still held, but it was changing shape. I'd kept the home for our son. Now I was starting to think I might need to keep it from him. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of day where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or stay clear. I'd been out running errands, the pharmacy, the post office, a stop at the community center to tighten a loose hinge on the front door. I had a bag of groceries in one hand and my keys in the other when I pulled into my driveway and noticed Sarah's car parked out front. She and Daniel hadn't mentioned they'd be stopping by. For a second I thought maybe they were surprising me, an impromptu dinner, a visit to make up for the last Father's Day. That flicker of hope was short-lived. As I stepped up to the porch, I heard their voices through the open front window. Not raised, but low. The kind of low where you lean in to hear more clearly, even if you know you shouldn't. "Nah, I'm telling you, it's the smartest move," Sarah was saying. "The market's still strong, and if we list before winter," Daniel cut in. "I know, but he's not going to just hand it over." "Then we need to make it look like it's for his own good," she replied, her voice sharper now. "You've seen how he's slowing down. We can frame it as safety. Too many stairs, too much upkeep. He'll believe you if you say it like you're worried about him." My grocery bag felt suddenly heavier, the plastic cutting into my fingers. I stood frozen, every word finding its mark. Daniel sighed. "And what if he says no?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that hums with unspoken meaning. "Then," Sarah said quietly, "we start making the case that it's not safe for him to be living alone. You know, paperwork, evaluations. Once we have that, it's easier to convince him, or someone else, to make the call." The cold that spread through me wasn't just about what they were saying. It was about who was saying it. My son, my only child. I backed away from the window before they could spot me. My first thought was to walk inside and confront them, to lay every word I'd heard on the table like a hand of cards and demand they explain themselves. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid of the argument, but because I knew it would give them exactly what they wanted, proof that I was emotional or unstable. So I walked around the side of the house, slipped in through the back door and made enough noise with my keys and the groceries that they'd hear me. When I came into the living room, they were sitting side by side on the couch. Sarah smiled in that polite way she'd perfected. "We thought we'd drop by," Daniel said, standing to take the grocery bag from me. "Help you put things away." We moved into the kitchen, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. They chatted about nothing, the weather, the price of gas, some TV show they'd been watching, while I nodded and made the appropriate noises. They left after half an hour, Daniel clapping me on the shoulder on the way out. "We should do a family dinner soon," he said. "Sure," I replied, my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. When the door closed behind them, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the faint ring a coffee mug had left on the wood. I thought about the promise I'd made to my wife, about the decades I'd spent keeping that house, our house, for Daniel. And now he was sitting in my living room, talking about how to take it from me like it was some business deal. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled the cedar box from my desk, opened it, and took out the will. I read it slowly, line by line, my eyes landing again on his name beside the house. By morning, my decision was made. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I called my lawyer. She'd been handling my paperwork for a long time, a practical woman who didn't waste words. "I want to make some changes to my will," I told her. "Of course," she said. "What are we changing?" When I told her, there was a brief pause on the line. Then, "Understood. We can draft it this week." I hung up and sat back in my chair, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. It wasn't joy I felt, or even relief. It was the quiet strength of knowing that I was reclaiming control. For years I'd thought the best way to honor my wife's memory was to pass the home on to our son. But I realized now that her memory wasn't in the bricks or the land. It was in the love we'd built there, the safety we'd carved out together. And that love deserved better than to be turned into a bargaining chip. If they saw me as a burden, if they wanted the house more than they wanted me, then they wouldn't get either. The morning after I spoke to my lawyer, the air in the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but steadier. Like the foundation had shifted back beneath my feet. I didn't rush into anything. This wasn't the kind of decision you make in a burst of heat and regret. I treated it like I was repairing an old beam, slow, careful, deliberate, checking every angle before committing. The lawyer and I met that Thursday in her office, a small room lined with neat rows of books and the faint scent of lemon polish. She listened as I explained, her pen moving across the legal pad in a calm, methodical rhythm. "You're certain?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm certain." We rewrote the will line by line. Daniel's name came out of the section about the house, replaced with the name of a local charity I'd been quietly supporting for years, a community shelter that helped single parents get back on their feet. My savings were divided differently now, spread across a handful of people and causes I trusted to use them well. When we were done, she slid the papers toward me. "This is legally binding the moment you sign," she said. I signed without hesitation. The pen didn't shake. Walking out of her office, I felt no rush of vindication, no triumphant music playing in my head. Just a kind of stillness. The peace that comes from knowing the choice is yours and no one can undo it without your consent. I didn't tell Daniel or Sarah. In fact, I made a point of keeping things exactly as they'd been. The same polite conversations, the same occasional visits. If they suspected anything had changed, they didn't show it. But inside me, something had shifted. Their words no longer landed with the same weight. When Sarah made another offhand remark about how a smaller place might suit me better, I smiled and changed the subject. When Daniel asked casually if I'd ever thought about selling, I said, "Oh, I think about a lot of things," and left it there. I started living differently, too, in small ways. I went to the farmer's market on Saturdays and bought fresh bread and flowers for the kitchen table. I spent more time at the community center, fixing chairs, mending leaky pipes, even repainting the front porch with a group of teenagers from the neighborhood. I began walking every morning, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, the quiet streets slowly waking. One evening, while planting marigolds in the front garden, I thought about my wife, about how much she'd loved this home, not for its market value but for the life inside it. She would have smiled to know it was going somewhere it could still be a place of shelter, not a line item on a real estate listing. Keeping the secret felt like holding a small ember in my pocket. It was warm, reassuring, and completely mine, but it also meant playing a role. When Daniel dropped by one Sunday afternoon, he wandered through the house like he was cataloging it. He paused in the living room, looking at the old photographs on the mantel. "You've still got all of Mom's things here," he said. "Ever think about, letting some of it go?" I looked at him evenly. "Some things are worth keeping," I said. He nodded, but I could see the flicker in his eyes. Frustration, maybe. I didn't rise to it. I didn't explain myself. I had no need to. The truth was, I had stopped trying to prove my worth to him. If he wanted to believe I was an aging burden holding on to a too big house, let him. I knew the truth, that I was the one making choices now, that my future and the house's future were already decided. It's a strange kind of freedom, holding that kind of knowledge in silence. And yet, there were moments when I almost wanted to tell him, not as a warning, but as a test, to see if he'd look me in the eye differently, if he'd realize that the man he thought he could manage had been quietly steering his own course all along. But I never did. Some truths are more powerful when they arrive unannounced. What would you do if someone you loved saw you as a burden? Would you forgive, or would you walk away? The thing about silence is, if you sit in it long enough, it starts to hum. Not with loneliness, not anymore, but with possibility. After the will was changed, I found myself with more space in my life than I'd realized I had. Not just in my calendar, but in my head, in my heart. The hours I once spent waiting for calls that never came, or preparing for visits that never happened, I started to fill with something else, other people. It began at the community center. I'd been volunteering off and on for years, mostly with maintenance work, fixing leaky sinks, mending the old wooden benches out front, tightening door hinges that squealed. But now I stayed longer, not just to work, but to linger. One morning I was replacing a cracked window in the main hall when a young man came in carrying a toddler on his hip. His name was Luis, and the little girl's name was Maribel. He just moved into a small apartment nearby after leaving a difficult situation, and the center was helping him with childcare while he worked part-time. We talked while I worked, about tools, about the neighborhood, about how hard it was to cook a decent meal in a kitchen the size of a closet. The next week, I brought him a cast-iron skillet I'd had in the garage for years, along with a bag of fresh vegetables from the market. It wasn't charity, it was just human. And once I opened that door, more connections followed. There was Janine, a retired teacher who came in twice a week to help kids with their reading. She had a laugh that could fill the whole room and a way of making even the shyest child read louder. We started having coffee together after her sessions, swapping stories about our younger years. There was Marcus, a teenager who came to the center every day after school because it was safer than going home. He reminded me of Daniel at that age. Restless energy, always tapping his foot, always glancing toward the door. I showed him how to change the oil in the center's old van, and the look on his face when the engine turned over was worth more than a dozen polite thanks from my own son. The more time I spent there, the more I realized something I hadn't wanted to face before. I didn't have to keep chasing a family that had already let go of me. I could build one. It wasn't about replacing Daniel. No one could do that. But there was room in my life for people who wanted to be there, people who didn't see me as a placeholder, but as a presence. One Saturday, the center hosted a small community dinner. Nothing fancy, just long tables in the hall, paper plates, and food everyone had pitched in to make. I roasted 2 chickens and brought a pie. By the time I got there, the hall was buzzing. Kids darted between the tables, adults swapped recipes and gossip, and laughter spilled into the parking lot. I sat beside Luis and Maribel, who kept reaching for bites of my pie with sticky fingers. Across the table, Janine was telling Marcus about the time she'd accidentally set off the fire alarm in the school cafeteria. I looked around and felt something I hadn't in years, a steady, uncomplicated sense of belonging. It struck me then. This was what a home was for, not just walls and furniture, not just a deed with a name on it. A home was meant to hold life, and here I was, surrounded by it. In quiet moments, I still thought about Daniel, about how different things could have been if he'd chosen to be part of my life instead of planning around it. But the ache wasn't as sharp now. It had softened into something I could carry without wincing. The house was still mine, and for now it was still standing in the same place it had for decades. But in my mind, its future was already shifting. I could see it as more than just the place where I lived. I could see it as a place where others might find the same shelter my wife and I had once built for our own family. And I knew exactly who I wanted it to shelter next. I started with the small things, not because they were easier, though they were, but because small things draw no suspicion. The first weekend I cleaned out the attic. Not just the junk I hadn't touched in years, but anything I knew I wouldn't need again. Boxes of old manuals for appliances I no longer owned, mismatched Christmas ornaments, a cracked bed frame that had been gathering dust for 2 decades. I donated what I could to the community center's thrift sale and hauled the rest to the curb. The house felt lighter almost immediately, as if it was exhaling. Next came the repairs. I walked from room to room with a small notepad, jotting down every creak in the floorboards, every hinge that stuck, every faucet that dripped. For weeks, I worked methodically. Loose steps on the porch were tightened, the back gate rehung so it closed cleanly, and I finally replaced the section of gutter that had been sagging since last winter. It wasn't about making the house perfect for me. It was about making it ready for the next people who would live here, the people who would need it. Some tasks were practical, others were personal. I repainted the living room, but I kept the shade of soft cream my wife had chosen years ago. I replaced the worn carpet in the hallway with polished wood, but I left the faint pencil marks on the pantry door that recorded Daniel's height through the years. I wanted the house to carry its history forward, not as a museum of my life, but as a place where history could keep being made. In the garden, I planted a rose bush under the kitchen window, just like my wife had once dreamed of doing. The first blooms would come next summer, long after my plans were complete. The thought gave me a quiet kind of satisfaction, something growing in my absence, something that wasn't for Daniel or Sarah, but for the future owners, the people who would love this home for what it gave them. Inside, I began rearranging things with purpose. The guest room, which had been little more than storage for years, I turned into a bright, welcoming space. New curtains, fresh bedding, a sturdy desk I refinished myself. I told anyone who asked, which was rare, that I was just making the place nicer. All the while I kept up my life as if nothing had changed. Daniel and Sarah came by once or twice, usually unannounced and never for long. Sarah's eyes would linger on the improvements, and I could see the mental calculations happening. I smiled through every visit, never hinting that the house she was measuring in her mind was one she would never own. One afternoon I invited Luis over to help me build a new set of shelves in the garage. He brought Maribel, who spent the afternoon drawing on scrap wood with a dull pencil while we worked. As we measured and cut, I told him the story of how I'd built the original shelves when Daniel was a boy, how he'd stood beside me holding the nails, eager to be part of the work. Luis listened quietly, then said, "Sounds like you put a lot into this place." "I have," I said, "and I want it to keep giving, even after I'm gone." He didn't press me on what I meant, but I could tell he understood. By the end of the summer, the house felt ready. Every repair was done, every space made welcoming, every corner touched with care. But more than that, I felt ready. The decision I'd made in my lawyer's office months earlier had shifted from an idea to a reality I could almost touch. I'd built this home to raise my son, to honor my wife's memory. Now, I was building it again, not for family by blood, but for family by choice. The most surprising part was how little Daniel or Sarah seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and they mistook my preparations for exactly what they'd been hoping for, a sign that I might be ready to move on. Let them think so. The day would come soon enough when they'd learn the truth. And when it did, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or explain my reasons. The work would speak for itself, because a house like this doesn't just hold walls and windows, it holds intention. And mine was already built into every nail, every coat of paint, every repaired hinge. It was no longer just my home, it was my message. It was early autumn when Daniel showed up unannounced. The air had that crisp edge that makes you reach for a sweater in the mornings, and I'd been out on the porch tightening the hinges on the front screen door when his car pulled into the driveway. He got out without his usual casual wave, walking up the path with a kind of measured pace. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Got a minute?" I stepped aside, holding the screen open. Always. Inside, he didn't sit. Instead, he wandered, first to the kitchen, then to the living room, glancing around like a man scanning a checklist. His eyes lingered on the freshly painted walls, the new carpet runner on the stairs, the tidy guest room he passed on the way to the back door. "You've been busy," he said finally. "Just keeping things in order," I replied. He leaned on the kitchen counter, fingers drumming lightly. "Sarah and I were talking. We just want to make sure you're thinking ahead. About, the future." There it was, the same subject, wrapped in a softer package. "I think about it all the time," I said, which was true, just not in the way he imagined. He nodded slowly like he was waiting for me to open the door to a bigger conversation. When I didn't, he continued. "I mean, if you ever decided this place was too much for you, we could help. Sell it, maybe move you somewhere smaller, closer to us, easier to keep an eye on you." The phrase "keep an eye on you" landed heavier than he intended. I smiled, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "I'll let you know if it comes to that." He studied me for a moment, then glanced toward the hallway. "Do you still have the paperwork for the house? Deed, mortgage stuff?" I tilted my head. "Why?" "Just curious. In case something ever happened and we needed to take care of it quickly." That was when I knew this wasn't just casual concern. He wasn't fishing for a conversation. He was taking inventory. I didn't lie. "I've got everything in a safe place." Then after a pause, "And it's all taken care of." He looked like he wanted to press, but instead he shrugged. "Good. Just wanted to be sure." We talked about smaller things after that. The weather, a football game he'd been watching, a new restaurant Sarah liked. But the undercurrent was there, steady as a slow tide. When he left, I stood at the window and watched his car pull away, the weight of his visit settling in my chest, not as hurt, not even as anger, but as confirmation. He wasn't going to stop circling the question. That night, I drove to my lawyer's office and slipped the final set of signed documents into her hands. We'd already changed the will months earlier, but now I had her draw up additional legal protections. Transfer papers that would ensure the house's future ownership couldn't be challenged, even if someone tried to contest the will. "It's airtight now," she said, sliding the folder back into her desk. "If anything happens to you, this place will go exactly where you've directed." Walking out into the cool evening air, I felt something inside me lock into place. Not a wall, but a foundation. From that point forward, I no longer worried about what Daniel or Sarah might try. They could visit as often or as little as they liked. They could drop their hints, make their suggestions, even try to keep an eye on me. The truth was, the decision had already been made and nothing they did could touch it. In the weeks that followed, I carried myself differently, not in a way they would notice. No sudden coldness, no pointed remarks, but with a quiet ease. I had stopped bracing for the next conversation about the house. When it came, and I knew it I would meet it with the calm of a man holding all the cards. It was a strange kind of freedom, living with the knowledge that the thing they wanted most was already beyond their reach. I could keep tending the garden, repainting the shutters, repairing the porch, not for them, but for the ones who would inherit it in spirit, the people who would understand what this place had been built for. The turning point wasn't just the paperwork, it was the shift in me, from defending what I had to building for what would come next. It happened on a Sunday morning in late spring, the kind of day when the air is soft, the sky pale, and the lilacs in the front yard smell like memory. I'd been at the community center the day before, helping set up for their annual fundraiser, and this morning, the local paper carried a front-page story about it. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Daniel's car. Sarah was with him. Both wore polite smiles, the kind you put on when you're about to deliver news you think will be persuasive. "Morning, Dad," Daniel said as he climbed the steps. "Got a minute to talk?" I gestured to the chairs. "Always." They didn't sit right away. Sarah handed me a folder, glossy printouts of real estate listings. "We've been doing some research," she said, her voice light. "And there are some really nice condos not far from us. Low maintenance, great amenities. We thought you might like—" I held up a hand, not unkindly. "Before we talk about that, I think you should read something." I reached behind me and slid the newspaper across the table. The headline read, "Community Center to Receive Historic Gift," Marjorie's Haven announced. Beneath it was a photo of me, standing beside the director of the center, in front of the building. The caption, "Local resident donates home to become shelter for families in need." Sarah's smile faltered first. "What is this?" "It's the future of this house," I said calmly. "When I'm gone, it will become Marjorie's Haven, a shelter for parents and children who need a safe place to start over. It's named after your mother." Daniel's eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with disbelief. "You donated the house?" "Yes," I said. "The paperwork's been done for months. It's legally binding. Nothing changes until I'm gone. But when that time comes, this place will keep doing what it was built for, keeping people safe." They both spoke at once. "You could have told us. This is our family home." "No," I said, my voice steady. "It was our family home, and now it will be a home for other families. I built it for love, not for profit, and I won't see it turned into a transaction." Daniel leaned back, shaking his head. "I can't believe you do this without talking to me." I met his gaze. "I can't believe you talk about taking it without talking to me." The silence after that was thick. Sarah looked like she was about to speak again, but I went on before she could. "This isn't about punishment. It's about purpose. Your mother and I built this house so our family would always have a place to belong. If you don't want to belong here with me, that's your choice. But I'll make sure it's always a place for someone who needs it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So that's it?" "That's it," I said. "And there's nothing either of you can do to change it." They didn't stay long after that. The folder of condo listings sat untouched on the table between us. When they left, the gravel in the driveway crackled under the tires, fading into the distance until all I could hear again was the soft breeze moving through the lilacs. I sat back in my chair, the coffee cooling in my hands, and looked at the house, the fresh paint on the shutters, the roses blooming under the kitchen window, the sturdy porch where so many conversations had been had, both good and hard. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace here, because now the house had a future, and it was a future no one could take away. The first morning after the fundraiser, the house felt different, not in its bones, those were the same, but in the air, as if it knew its next chapter had finally been spoken aloud. I stood in the garden with a cup of coffee, watching the early sun slide across the porch. The roses I'd planted last year were just beginning to open, pale petals catching the light. I thought of Marjorie, how she'd always wanted roses under the kitchen window, and how she used to say a home should smell like welcome. Down the street, I could hear the faint chatter of children heading to the community center for the morning programs. Soon, some of them would be living here, sleeping in the rooms Daniel once called his, running through the hallway with the same carefree energy he'd once had. It didn't ache the way I thought it might. If anything, it felt right, as though the house had been waiting for this all along. I walked the length of the garden, touching each bloom lightly, and felt the quiet hum of satisfaction in my chest. I'd kept my promise to Marjorie. I'd kept the home safe, not for the person we thought it would be for, but for the people who would need it most. The gravel in the driveway crunched under my feet as I made my way back to the porch. I paused at the top step, looking once more at the place I had built nail by nail, year by year. It would outlast me now, not as an inheritance, but as a refuge. Inside, the morning light pooled on the kitchen table. I sat down, coffee in hand, and let the warmth seep in. The future was no longer something to brace for. It was already here, and it was good. Outside, a breeze carried the scent of roses through the open window, and for the first time in a long time the house smelled like welcome again.